Have you ever thought that adding a necromancer to your narrative is the perfect way to spice things up? After all, what's cooler than a character who can command the dead, right? But here's a shocking truth I've learned from more than 2 decades of writing and studying fantasy. Necromancy is often the kiss of death for otherwise great stories. In this video, I'll show you the 5 cardinal sins of writing necromancy, unveil the secrets to creating unforgettable necromancers, and demonstrate how to use death as your story's most powerful element. Before we get to this though, let me first tell you what exactly a necromancer is and how they have evolved from ancient myths to modern fantasies. Because without this understanding, you are almost guaranteed to wreck your story by adding necromancy. Picture this: a cloaked figure standing in a moonlit graveyard, arms raised as corpses crawl their way out of the earth. It's an image that's become almost cliché in fantasy. But have you ever stopped to wonder why necromancers are so alluring and so dangerous for writers? Necromancy, the art of communicating with or raising the dead, isn't just some modern fantasy trope. Its roots stretch back thousands of years, woven into the fabric of human mythology and folklore. In ancient Greece, necromancers were the oracles of the dead, seeking wisdom from beyond the grave. The Odyssey tells us about Odysseus summoning shades with blood sacrifices. Fast forward to medieval times, and necromancy became tangled with demonology, seen as a dark and forbidden art. But here's where it gets interesting. In many of these early tales, necromancers weren't the villains. They were seekers of knowledge, bridges between the world of the living and the dead. It wasn't until much later that they got their bad rap. So how do we get from wise oracles to cackling villains? Enter modern fantasy. From Tolkien's Necromancer, who turned out to be Sauron himself, to Terry Pratchett's humorous take in the Discworld series, necromancers have evolved into a complex archetype. They play on our fascination with death, our fear of the unknown, and our desire to control the uncontrollable. Now imagine you're deep into writing your epic fantasy. Your hero is on a perilous quest, the stakes are high, and the tension is palpable. Then, in a stroke of what you think is genius, you introduce a powerful necromancer. Suddenly, your carefully crafted plot starts to unravel faster than a mummy's bandages. Why? Because necromancers are the ultimate plot hole generators. They are like narrative dynamite, powerful, yes, but one wrong move and boom, your story's internal logic explodes. Think about it. If your necromancer can raise the dead, what's stopping them from bringing back that crucial character you just killed off for dramatic effect? Or worse, what's to prevent them from creating an unstoppable army of the undead and steamrolling over every obstacle? But here's where it gets really tricky. It's not just about plot holes. Necromancers have this nasty habit of hijacking your story's tone. One minute you're writing a lighthearted adventure. The next, you're knee-deep in existential dread and moral quandaries. Take the Harry Potter series for example. When Voldemort, essentially a dark wizard with necromantic powers, enters the scene, the entire tone of the story shifts. Suddenly, we're not just dealing with school rivalries and magical hijinks. We're confronting the nature of death itself. And let's not forget about your readers. Fantasy fans are a savvy bunch. They'll spot a poorly thought out necromancer faster than you can say, "Rise, my minions." If your death magic doesn't make sense within your world's rules, or if it conveniently solves problems without consequences, you lose their trust faster than a zombie loses its limbs. But don't despair just yet. The flip side of this double-edged sword is equally powerful. A well-crafted necromancer can be the secret ingredient that transforms your story from good to unforgettable. Imagine using a necromancer to explore themes of grief and letting go, or to challenge your character's beliefs about the afterlife. What if your necromancer's powers came at a terrible personal cost? Suddenly, you're not just telling a fantasy story, you're delving into the human condition itself. In a world where the dead can be brought back, what does that mean for religion, for warfare, for the grief of losing a loved one? These are the questions that can elevate your story from a simple tale of good versus evil to a rich, complex narrative that stays with your readers long after they turn the last page. And that's the true power of necromancy in storytelling. When handled with care, it's not just about raising the dead, it's about breathing new life into your narrative. A necromancer isn't just a wizard who happens to raise zombies. They're a character who challenges the very foundations of your fantasy world. So you've decided to add a necromancer to your story. Great. But how do you make sure your death-dealing wizard doesn't end up as lifeless as the corpses erase? Let's dive into the art of crafting necromancer that will haunt your readers' imaginations in all the right ways. First things first, forget everything you think you know about necromancers. That cackling villain in a dark robe? Toss that stereotype in the graveyard where it belongs. The key to creating a compelling necromancer is to think beyond the surface level of their powers. Remember, a necromancer is a person first, death magic wielder second. What drove them to pursue this forbidden art? Was it grief over a lost loved one? An insatiable thirst for knowledge? Or maybe they stumbled into it by accident and now they're way in over their head. By giving your necromancer a rich backstory and clear motivations, you're already leagues ahead of the generic evil sorcerer type. But here's where it gets really interesting. What if your necromancer isn't the villain at all? Imagine a world where necromancy is a respected profession, like medicine or law. Your protagonist could be a necromancer detective, solving murders by interviewing the victims. Or perhaps they're a healer, using their powers to ease the passing of the terminally ill. By subverting reader expectations, you create instant intrigue. But that doesn't mean you should shy away from using them for evil. Just do it consciously. Now let's talk about research next. Yes, I said research. Just because you're writing fantasy doesn't mean you can skim on the details. Dive into historical accounts of necromancy, for example. Study different cultural attitudes towards death and the afterlife. The more you understand about the real-world roots of these concepts, the more authentic and nuanced your necromancer will feel. But here's a word of caution. Don't get so caught up in the details that you forget about character development. Your necromancer needs to grow and change throughout the story, just like any other character. Maybe they start off using their powers recklessly, only to learn the true cost of tampering with death. Or perhaps they begin as a reluctant necromancer, slowly embracing their abilities as they realize the good they can do, or the evil. Well, let's address the elephant in the room, or should I say the skeleton. Okay, I know that was bad, but let's get back to the question. How do you make a character who deals with death relatable to readers? The trick is to focus on universal themes. Everyone has experienced loss, fear of the unknown, or the desire to change fate. Your necromancer is a conduit for exploring these deeply human experiences. Consider giving your necromancer a personal cost for using their powers. Maybe each time they raise the dead, they lose a piece of their own life force. Or perhaps they retain the memories of those they've resurrected, slowly losing their sense of self. This not only adds depth to the character, but also creates built-in conflict and tension. Lastly, don't forget about the supporting cast. How do other characters react to your necromancer? Are they feared, respected, misunderstood? The interactions between your necromancer and the world around them can be a goldmine for character development and plot progression. Remember, at the end of the day, a compelling necromancer is one that makes your readers think. They should challenge preconceptions about life, death, and the blurry line between. Get this right, and your necromancer won't just be raising the dead, they'll be raising the bar for fantasy storytelling. Now, if you found anything useful in the video so far, please consider giving it a like to help me grow the channel. Thank you. Okay, you've crafted a compelling necromancer, so it's time to build a world that can contain their power without falling apart at the seams. First, let's talk about magic systems. Necromancy shouldn't exist in a vacuum. How does it relate to other forms of magic in your world? Is it a forbidden branch of a larger magical tradition, or a separate art entirely? The key is consistency. If your necromancers can raise armies of the dead, make sure there's a logical reason why everyone isn't doing it. Consider the energy cost, for example. Maybe necromancy drains the life force of the caster, or requires rare and gruesome components. These limitations not only balance your magic system, but also create natural plot points and conflicts. But don't forget to zoom out to the big picture. How does the existence of necromancy shape your world's societies? Are necromancers feared and hunted, or revered as spiritual leaders? Think about the legal, religious, and ethical frameworks that would evolve in a world where death isn't necessarily the end. Perhaps there are strict regulations on who can be resurrected, or maybe there's a thriving black market for powerful corpses. The possibilities are endless, but they should all stem logically from the basic premises of your world. Lastly, remember the golden rule of magic systems. Maintain an air of mystery. While it's important to have rules, don't explain every detail of how necromancy works. Leave room for wonder and discovery. After all, the unknown is often more terrifying and more captivating than the fully explained. Now, with your necromancer and world fully established, let's harness the true narrative power of death in your story. Necromancers are plot catalysts par excellence. Their very presence raises questions and creates conflict. Use this to your advantage. A necromancer can kick off your plot by raising the wrong person, or by refusing to raise someone important. But here's the tricky part. Maintaining stakes in a world where death can be reversed. The key is to establish clear limits and consequences for resurrection. Maybe the raised dead are never quite the same, returning without memories or with a terrible hunger for the living. Or perhaps each resurrection requires a death in exchange, forcing characters into impossible moral choices. These limitations don't just maintain tension, they open up new avenues for exploring themes of life, death, and power. What does it mean to live when death is no longer permanent? How does the possibility of resurrection change how people value life? Use your Necromancer and the power of death to delve into these deep universal questions. Show how different characters grapple with the implications of cheating death. Some might desperately cling to loved ones, while others accept the natural cycle of life and death. Remember, the most powerful stories about death are really stories about life. Use necromancy not just as a cool magic system, but as a lens through which to examine what it truly means to be alive. Okay, now that we've explored the ins and outs of crafting compelling necromancers and integrating them into your world, let's talk about the pitfalls you need to avoid. I call these the 5 cardinal sins of writing necromancers. Commit any of these and you risk turning your story into a graveyard of wasted potential. Sin number 1, the overpowered necromancer. You might think making your necromancer all-powerful is cool, but it's actually a fast track to boring your readers. When your death mage can raise entire armies with a snap of their fingers, you've essentially created a win button for any conflict. The fix? Give your necromancer specific thematic limitations. Maybe they can only raise those who've died unjustly, or their power waxes and wanes with the phases of the moon. These kinds of restrictions not only balance your story, but also add depth to your world's magical system. Sin number 2 then is the ethical vacuum. Necromancy is a moral minefield, and ignoring that is a missed opportunity. Your character is potentially violating the autonomy of the dead. There should be some serious cultural and personal repercussions. Instead of glossing over the ethical implications, dive into them. Show how different cultures in your world view necromancy. Perhaps one society sees it as a sacred duty to ancestors, while another views it as the ultimate taboo. Your necromancer navigating these conflicting viewpoints can drive fascinating plot developments. Sin number 3 then is the death of consequences. If death becomes meaningless in your story, so do the stakes. Using necromancy as a reset button for any character death cheapens the entire concept of mortality in your world. So the solution for that is to make resurrection a complex, unpredictable process. Maybe the raised retain only fragments of their former selves as suggested before, or they come back changed in completely unexpected ways. What if a resurrected character returns with knowledge from the afterlife that shakes the foundations of your world's beliefs? The opportunities are endless. Just try to find something that works with your story. Sin number 4 is the necromantic info dump. Yes, you've done your research. Yes, your magic system is intricate and well thought out. But no, your readers don't need to know every single detail about necromancy and how it works in your world. Remember the golden rule? Maintain mystery. Instead of explaining every ritual and the materials needed for them, show the effects of necromancy through your character's experiences and emotions. The terror of a first resurrection, the uncanny feeling of speaking with the long dead. These moments will stick with your readers far more than a textbook explanation of magical theory. And the 5th and last sin is the one-dimensional death mage. Your necromancer is more than just their ability to raise the dead. If that's all there is to them, you've created a plot device, not a character. The remedy here? Give your necromancer passions and skills unrelated to their magical abilities. Maybe they're an avid gardener, finding peace and nurturing life to balance their dealings with death. Or perhaps they're a talented musician, using their art to process the emotional toll of their powers. They could also just be plain evil, making up for some bad experiences they had as a child. But whatever additional layers you add, they will make your necromancer feel like a real person, not just a walking plot point. And as a bonus tip, consider exploring how your necromancer's powers affect their everyday life. Do they avoid shaking hands for fear of accidentally sensing someone's impending death? Or can they never enjoy a peaceful walk through a graveyard? These small details can add richness to your character and world. By avoiding all of these 5 sins, you'll be well on your way to creating necromancers that enhance your story rather than killing it. Remember, in the end, it's not about the magic, it's about the person wielding it and the world they inhabit. And just like necromancy, there are other types of ancient magic that are perfect to transform your world building and story. Check out this video here next, where I introduce you to 8 of these magical traditions, one more intriguing than the other.